Zohran Mamdani, Andrew Cuomo, and Curtis Sliwa meet on the debate stage with only 3 weeks left in the campaign to be New York City's next mayor. But are the latter two men running out of time to shake up this election, given the yawning size of Mamdani's polling lead?
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues on the editorial page, Menehue Barua and Faith Bottom. For 2 hours on Thursday night, the three candidates tangled from a studio at Rockefeller Center, arranged somewhat confusingly to the viewer, former Governor Andrew Cuomo on the left of the screen, Republican Curtis Sliwa in the middle, and on the right, the socialist and Democratic nominee, Zohran Mamdani, who, to my eye, Monet looked pretty smooth. It looked like a man who knows that he's winning. Let's listen to one of these clips. This is the two frontrunners tangling about the past and some of Mamdani's statements.
The assemblyman will not denounce Hamas. The assemblyman will not denounce Hassan Piker, who said America deserved 9/11. The assemblyman just said in his response, well, it depends on occupation. That is code, meaning that Israel does not have a right to exist as a Jewish state, which he has never acknowledged. That is from the river to the sea. That's why he won't denounce globalize the Intifada, which means kill all Jews.
Let's give Mr. Mamdani a chance to respond to that.
I want to be very clear. The occupation is a reference to international law and the violation of it, which Mr. Cuomo has no regard for since he signed up to be Benjamin Netanyahu's legal defense team during the course of this genocide. And I find the comments that Hassan made on 9/11 to be objectionable and reprehensible. And I also think that part of the reason why Democrats are in the situation that we are in, of being a permanent minority in this country, is we are looking only to speak to journalists and streamers and Americans with whom we agree of every single thing that they say.
Monet, what was your take on this first of two debates with another scheduled between these candidates next week? Does anybody move the political needle here?
Well, I mean, with less than a month to go before Election Day and the race having been fairly consistent for the past month or so, with the exception of Eric Adams dropping out, the debate really was kind of a last chance or a last best chance for Andrew Cuomo to try to narrow that gap. Most of the polls have Mamdani with about 45% of the vote compared with 35 at best, and usually a little bit less than that for Cuomo. And so the ball was really in Cuomo's court to try to do something to shake it up, and particularly to put a lot of Mamdani's weaknesses in front of an audience or tempt him into a self-destructive moment. And he wasn't really able to do that. I think Cuomo, he hammered Mamdani on a few things like past statements about defunding the police that are unpopular in a lot of New Yorkers' eyes. He hammered him about his lack of experience and the fact that this would be his first managerial job. But we didn't really hear anything that we hadn't heard before. And I think Mamdani was well prepared and was able to dodge a lot of those attacks. And so I don't think that anything that we saw in this debate is really going to go viral or potentially reshift the race in a significant way.
The polling is remarkable. Mamdani seems to be, if anything, pulling away from these other two candidates. A Fox News survey this week has Mamdani with 52% above a majority threshold, Cuomo with 28%, Sliwa with 14%, and Eric Adams with 2%. Eric Adams still on the ballot, apparently, because he withdrew after the time to get off of the ballot. On the point about the experience argument that Cuomo is making, here is another clip of those two frontrunners looking more toward the future.
And this is not a job for someone who has no management experience to run 300,000 people, no financial experience to run $115 billion budget. He literally has never had a job. On his resume, it says he interned for his mother. This is not a job for a first-timer. Any day, you could have a hurricane, you have, God forbid, a 9/11, a health pandemic. If you don't know what you're doing,
Cuomo.
people could die.
Mr. Mamdani, want to respond?
And if we have a health pandemic, then why would New Yorkers turn back to the governor who sent seniors to their death in nursing homes? That's kind of experience that's on offer here today. What I don't have in experience, I make up for in integrity. And what you don't have in integrity, you could never make up for in experience.
Yeah.
Ouch. I mean, pretty strong on both sides, Faith. And notably, you recently wrote about this New York mayor's race, and the headline was, "Can Cuomo beat Mamdani?" He's showing more life in his independent campaign for mayor, but it may be too little, too late. And why do you say, I mean, we've talked a little bit about too late, but why do you say too little?
Yeah, if the question is too little, too late, then yes, Cuomo is doing not a whole lot in terms of his campaigning. He's made noises about being the sane one, appealing to the working class, but he's still running his campaign as though this were 1996, and as if big dollar TV ads were going to sway the electorate. One of the most striking things I've noticed about Mamdani is that, he's running on virality and aesthetics. In a campaign of aesthetics, Cuomo is looking really ugly right now, at the very least dated. Mamdani has put together a very pleasing campaign to look at: graphic design, TikToks with just the right filters. His wife is an artist. His mother is a filmmaker, and it all really shows. There's a vibe in pictures and videos that most other politicians just don't have right now, and certainly something Cuomo doesn't have. And what this allows Mamdani to do is take advantage of the fact that the culture of attention is shifting. Mamdani realizes that the value of going viral is important. He has 10 million followers on TikTok. Cuomo has 10,000. There's a huge gap there. Cuomo's spending most of his time buying TV ads, and that just looks incredibly dated now. Cuomo probably thought that he could skate by this election based off of his name recognition alone. And at the beginning of the race, that didn't look unreasonable. But now he has to run, and we just aren't seeing it.
On this point about virality and aesthetics, Monet, something that has struck me as well. I mean, Cuomo is going after Mamdani, saying, you don't know how this place works. You can't get this stuff done. You need Albany. But it is very nuts and bolts. And it calls to mind a quote from another famous New York politician, that you campaign in poetry and you govern in prose. And that is, of course, attributed to Mario Cuomo, the former governor and Andrew Cuomo's father. And it is an interesting contrast here, because I think that Cuomo is right in many of those criticisms of Mamdani. I mean, I don't think that you can come in and sweep into the mayor's office and just make the buses free and universal health care and open government-run grocery stores and somehow convince Albany to raise the taxes that you need to pay for all that stuff. On the other hand, there is something about Mamdani as people find him aspirational. He speaks in this high-flying rhetoric, and then Andrew Cuomo comes in and says, well, actually, let me tell you how to really run the government. And, I mean, it's an interesting contrast there.
Yeah, I think the funny thing about it is that Andrew Cuomo has actually shown himself able to govern in poetry, at least a little bit during the course of his governorship. If you can remember those first few weeks of COVID, when he was holding press conferences, he had some moments, my mother's not indispensable, your mother's not indispensable, really rallying New Yorkers to fight it off. And people really thought he was inspirational. But I think he thinks, and correctly so, he's not going to out poetry Zohran Mamdani. Zohran Mamdani is a really rare, somewhat, even generational political talent. He's a master of the social media format, but even on the debate stage, he's just very slick, very polished. And so I think Cuomo thinks I have to play to my strengths here. The reason voters are going to prefer me over Mamdani is because A, I have governing experience, and B, I understand the pitfalls of some of the more radical policies that Mamdani is pitching. And so he's really just trying to heighten the contrast between himself and Mamdani rather than trying to compete on Mamdani's terms.
Let's give a word to the man in the middle. This is Curtis Sliwa at the debate, the Republican nominee.
If you have free bus fare, and the Citizens Budget Commission said just last year, 2024, $1 billion of fare evasion in all different forms, this MTA system will collapse. There's not enough money out there to make up for fare evasion. Pay your fare. If you don't pay your fare, they have fare programs for the poor and the indigent. But everybody should be forced to pay their fare.
Faith, part of what it makes Cuomo's job difficult also is, what is the Cuomo coalition at this point? He lost the Democratic primary after being a Democrat for his whole livelong life. And, even if Sliwa dropped out, there's some polls suggesting that that wouldn't be enough to make up his deficit against Mamdani. And, that makes some intuitive sense because although New York is a blue city where the Democratic ballot line is worth a lot to a politician, there are still Republicans here, many of whom never voted for Cuomo as governor, don't want Cuomo to be the mayor of New York City. There's nothing for them to be excited about. And also, Cuomo, I think, has difficulty trying to reach out to those voters. He doesn't know how to speak to them. So he's been hammering this point about Zohran Mamdani being a socialist, and that doesn't work. And yet when he came in and visited with the Journal's editorial board, he was asked, well, are you a capitalist? And he said very tepidly, yes, we have a capitalist system in the United States. Regulated capitalist system, basically, is what he said. And, to my mind, that's kind of a softball question for a politician sitting in New York City. You say, look out the window, greatest city in the world, all of the wealth that has been created, lifting people out of poverty. And, as a Democratic candidate, you could still shade that with stuff about making sure nobody's left behind and whatnot. But he seems... he's gotten comfortable with attacking socialism, but he's not comfortable with defending capitalism in a way that a lot of Republicans, a lot of conservatives who, if they're going to be brought on board a Stop Mamdani ticket are going to want to hear.
Yeah, no, Cuomo's just had a really rough go of it, trying to appeal to the left and the right. I checked the Real Clear Politics polling average today, and, it has Mamdani up 18 points against Cuomo. That's just such a steep hill for Cuomo to climb at this point. Maybe Cuomo can win if enough working class voters show up to vote. And it's true that more of the older population, as he said in the meeting, will turn out in the general election than showed up that showed up in the primary for Mamdani. But, the fact is that Mamdani really did win the primary. He has a Democratic nomination, which is just a huge advantage and proves to anyone that doubts Mamdani that he has the chops to beat Cuomo. And then there's Trump. Maybe Cuomo could pull it out if every New Yorker who voted for Trump, which is, roughly 30% of the city, shows up on election day and votes for him. But, Cuomo can't say he's the anti-Trump candidate when a vote for Mamdani is clearly a symbolic vote against Trump. So he's just in a terrible position, and this is a moment when there's significant backlash to Trump. And, New York is its bellwether right now. If America's thinking we want someone to shake things up, then Mamdani will win.
Monet, what about that question about what a mayor of New York City can do and can't do on his own? There's now, as Mamdani's lead has increased, it seems to me there's been more and more chatter about that question. Maybe people resigned to his victory, trying to figure out exactly how deep into these kind of socialist ideas the mayor on his own can send the city. But notably, this tax portion is part that he would really depend on Albany for. And yet there was a press conference that he had with Governor Kathy Hochul and talking about universal child care. Hochul saying she's excited to work with him on universal child care, suggesting maybe wavering on this question about Albany raising taxes. Monet, how do you read that question? Are people who are saying, the mayor is just the mayor's office, are they getting their hopes up?
Yeah, I think since the very beginning of Mamdani's surge in the Democratic primary, a lot of his skeptics who understand how state and local governance work in New York City have kind of hung their hats on the fact that so much of his agenda is going to depend on additional revenue that he wouldn't on his own have the ability to levy. Of course, New York City itself is actually in a budget crunch. Mayor Adams had to cut the budget several times just to kind of keep existing operations afloat. So if Mamdani wants to add all of these new entitlements like childcare up to the age of 5, free buses, things like that, they're going to need billions and billions of new dollars, which means they're going to need tax increases, and the state legislature and the governor of New York would have to sign off on that. So Kathy Hochul for the past several years has really been hesitant to increase specifically the income tax. She said very forthrightly that I don't want to raise it, and has admitted that doing so can chase high earners out of the city. And we've already seen a lot of them go to Florida or to Texas. But I think that she is under a lot of pressure because of how popular Mamdani has become and because of how much of a national figure, much better known and well regarded among a lot of the party base than she is. And he's advocating for a lot of these things that Democratic voters are showing that they want. And so she doesn't want to stonewall him and say, I'm not going to allow him to keep his promises to New York City voters. She's under a lot of pressure to at least say, I'm going to work with him. Maybe we'll find some kind of middle ground. And so as she has now endorsed him and moved in his direction, all of those people who are counting on Albany to be that check on Mamdani are going to have to look elsewhere, because it seems like she's going to really be cooperating with a lot of what he wants to do, including that tax increase.
That's not to say, though, that there are not hopes that have been raised by Mamdani's supporters as well that might end up being dashed. Faith, you talked about the virality of the Mamdani social media campaign, and that actually has been one of Cuomo's complaints. You wrote about this in your op-ed, quoting Cuomo as saying this: TikTok is nice because it's only 3 words and nobody asks any questions. Freeze the rent. Oh, great. That means he freezes my rent. Well, actually, no. And when he visited the Journal, he was talking about meeting with some voters, and they were saying Mamdani's going to freeze my rent. And Cuomo was explaining that there are a lot of apartments and residences in New York City that are not under the rent control or rent stabilization laws. But that is a question that may be lost on people who are just getting news, politics, information from these new forms of media that we have that often are the candidate themselves controlling the message, or at the very least a friendly interviewer without the kind of pushback that you get, to their credit in these kinds of debates where there are moderators that are trying to keep the politicians honest.
Yeah. One of the things that has really surprised me is Mamdani's virality throughout all this, and it's really interesting. One of the things I'm really thinking about is what this means nationally. New York is kind of a strange city in that people will pay attention simply because it's one of the most important cities in the world. Back in the 1960s, you had the Republican mayor, John Lindsay, who ran on the slogan that, being mayor of New York was the second toughest job in America. Much of that symbolic. The thing that I've been thinking about a lot with the rise of Mamdani, the rise of TikTok, these little sound bites of, socialism is great, is what this means for the Democratic Party. And there are things to worry about, both for the right and the left. What happens if socialism takes over the Democratic Party? For the right, that means more extremism. But for the left, the inevitable failure of Mamdani's socialism in New York, which will be echoed in other places where his playbook is copied, just won't play well nationally, I think. This is a race that's more than New York City. It serves as a bellwether for the direction of the Democratic Party, especially after Trump's win in 2024. The country would be better to have a pretty sane Democratic Party right now. But that's just not where we are right now.
Monet, how do you think about this? How big of a problem a Mamdani victory might be for Democrats nationally? I mean, I tend to agree with Faith that other candidates in the Democratic Party who are thinking about running and maybe running primary campaigns against older candidates are going to inevitably see this high-profile figure and his success as a model, both in terms of just how to organize a campaign and on social media and be on TikTok everywhere and use, three-word slogans like freeze the rent, but also in terms of what kind of issues can get noticed and get attention. And so it does suggest to me that if Mamdani is politically successful, we're going to see more of these kinds of campaigns in probably blue cities around the country. But that does seem to make the Democratic Party's national problem worse, in that it is kind of split right now between, the representatives of big cities, places like New York, Chicago, San Francisco, and Democrats who are trying to win in other places, and sometimes doing so successfully, threading the needle, navigating. Abigail Spanberger, perhaps, in Virginia as one example. But if she says, she was famous for saying never use the word socialist again to some of her colleagues on a call after Democrats were politically drubbed, and that becomes much harder to do if the mayor of America's biggest city is literally a Democratic socialist who is running as a Democratic candidate.
Yeah, I definitely think that Mamdani has already become one of the faces of the Democratic Party. If he wins, that will increase by 2 or 3-fold. And you will see a lot of Democrats trying to essentially rerun his playbook. I think that there are a lot of Democrats who are, Zohran Mamdani's age, relatively younger, who share his values when it comes to income redistribution, when it comes to skepticism about policing, all of these things. But these candidates often have a hard time raising money and really getting any institutional support because people don't think that they're going to be viable. The donor class doesn't think that they can win. When you have someone like Mamdani secure one of the highest offices in the country or the most visible offices in the country, all of a sudden that's going to confer legitimacy on a lot of other left-wing candidates, and you'll see a lot more of them running. And I think we saw this in 2018 with AOC, who very much was in the Mamdani mold. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez won that surprise primary victory and won that House seat. And all of a sudden, you now have several members of Congress who are also far to the left of where the Democratic Party traditionally was. In the state legislatures, this is something Andrew Cuomo pointed out. You do see a lot of DSA members also. But I do think it's also going to provoke a backlash among conservatives. As you mentioned, there will be a lot of people who will be able to point to these candidates once they aren't just on the fringes and are actually holding high offices and say, this is the direction the Democratic Party is pushing. They don't want to secure your cities. They want to raise taxes on you. And Republicans are going to be able to make headway essentially by running against that. And so who comes out ahead? I think probably Republicans actually benefit. And this is something that Trump has been essentially baiting New Yorkers to elect Mamdani with the sense that that's going to then lead to a crackdown and the resurgence of conservatism as people in the center react against socialism.
But be careful what you wish for. And Faith, to your point about whether this kind of further party polarization is good for the country. We have a two-party system, and you could always have a nominee of one party who, has some flaws, but gets in because the other nominee collapses for some reason, some kind of external scandal, just to make up an example. And it calls to mind, I'm sure there are Republicans out there in the rest of the country that are thinking a Mamdani victory in New York, that will be great for us. We can run against Kami Mamdani. Maybe Republicans can pick up the New York governorship then. But if it calls to mind those Democrats, progressives in the 2016 primaries who were rooting for Donald Trump and thinking this will be so great if Donald Trump wins, it will be a cakewalk for us. And whoops, 8 years later, it didn't work out quite so well for them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is something that Cuomo talked a lot about when he came in to talk to us, that, Trump is going to save New York from Kami Mamdani. And, there's something interesting about that. Who does Donald Trump actually want to win this election? And, yes, Republicans have a lot to be happy about if Mamdani wins. They can just talk about virality. They can just put TikTok and video after video of, the horrible things that go wrong in New York City. This is good. I could absolutely see this being good for Republicans.
Thank you, Faith and Monet. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back next week with another edition of Potomac Watch.